out university experience. This is the Leadership and Equity event, and we have a phenomenal conversation with you today. I am Marcellus Womack, host of this amazing session on this very special MLK holiday. This incredible conversation is titled The Dream by Any Means. The Dream by Any Means, the revolutionary intersection between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Our very special guest with us here today is Dr. Peniel E. Joseph. He is an author of this extraordinary book. This is a must read. It's available on blackbookstore.com and all of the sites where you read, but you want to go to blackbookstore.com, owned by Rolling Out. This is The Sword and the Shield, the revolutionary lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. We're going to dig all into this book right here of how their lives converged. Two of the greatest champions of humanity that the world has ever seen, Martin and Malcolm. You are going to get the most in-depth research and conversation on this right here. So, Dr. Joseph, he is the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin. So, without further ado, Dr. Joseph, thank you so much for joining us, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Oh, thank you, Brother Marcellus. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here on this special day and this special occasion and commemoration.
Yes. And reading this book, The Sword and the Shield, it has become for me an instant classic. I can open it, I got notes all throughout it, underlining it. And this is a journey. You start from the beginning of their lives and where their careers started, and you are able to find just such synergy in a way that I've never seen it. And you are able to find information and provide insight and context to the civil rights movement, their lives, and the impact on not only the Black community and Black freedom, but in a way that shows a unified front with two of the greatest men that um, I've never seen. I am in awe. So, if you could tell us first about just your journey and what
Yeah.
inspired you to go so deeply into these incredible men, Martin and Malcolm.
Well, yeah, I'm a proud native New Yorker. Grew up in the city, proud son of Haitian immigrants who came to the United States in the 1960s. And I grew up in a household where political activism and conversation about Black history, Haitian history, African history, Caribbean history, just Pan-African household. So I was really always interested in Black radicals and revolutionaries. Malcolm X, we had the autobiography of Malcolm X at the house. We had CLR James's The Black Jacobins, The History of the Haitian Revolution at the house, books by Angela Davis and others at the house. So my mom's library. So I think in a lot of ways it was destined to be either a political activist, organizer, or some kind of writer, intellectual. And I've tried to merge both. So I've written a lot about the Black Power movement. I've written a lot about these different social movements. And I think that is what inspired me to write about Malcolm and Martin. And the more I read about each of them and did research on each of them, Marcellus, the more I saw that there were a lot more convergences than divergences. So it wasn't just American dream versus nightmare. I saw that they were both really dual sides of the same revolutionary coin.
That is amazing. Dual sides of the revolutionary coin, capturing it incredibly. Break down the sword and the shield. Who was the sword? Who was the shield, and why?
And that's one of the reasons why I did the title, and I do really love the title. I think we usually think of Malcolm as the sword and King as the shield, but I argue in the book that they both served as sword and shield at various times in their career. And here's what I mean. So when we think about Malcolm as the political sword of the Black community, what I argue is that Malcolm, he innovates radical Black dignity, right? And that's that what that Black radical dignity is Malcolm is the person building on the work of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who starts the largest Black mass movement in world history, Universal Negro Improvement Association, building on the work of Garvey and Garveyism. What Malcolm does is really show Black people globally that we are human beings, we are worthy of love, and we have God-given dignity. And that's really important. So when we think about Malcolm, sometimes people ask me, well, what did Malcolm do for us? Like, what is his legislative accomplishment? What did he do? I tell them, Malcolm X turned Negroes into Black people. That's what he did for you, and you're welcome. You're welcome, Marcellus, right? He turned
Very
Negroes, whether
welcome.
you were dark skin, light skin, brown skin, he turned Negroes into Black people all over the world, not just in Harlem, not just in Lansing, Michigan, not just in Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland. He inspired folks in Africa and in Latin America, Central America, Europe. Malcolm is the person that we owe our acknowledgement that we are human beings with dignity, and we are worthy of love. We are worthy of protection. We are worthy people to flourish. That is Malcolm X. Now, when we think about Malcolm as the sword, why do we call him the sword? Well, Malcolm really serves, and I argue this in the book, as Black America's prosecuting attorney. And he is prosecuting white America for a series of crimes against Black America that go back to racial slavery. So Malcolm is willing to courageously speak truth to power and say that the United States government and the United States military and the United States law enforcement are actually criminals who have continued to commit crimes against Black babies, women, children in the 1950s and the 1960s. He's willing to speak truth to power, but he also says the United States has committed crimes against Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America. So Malcolm's an anti-imperialist. He's got a critique of capitalism and a critique of American violence, right? And he's willing to call out the country and say that these aren't contradictions or aberrations. This is actually who the country is, right? That's what Malcolm does, right? And when we think about King is the innovator of what I call Black radical citizenship or radical Black citizenship. And what that means is that King argues that Black people are citizens, and citizenship goes beyond voting rights. It goes beyond civil rights. He talks about guaranteed income. He talks about environmental justice. He talks about quality education and food justice. He says that we have the right to live in violent-free neighborhoods, but also to flourish, right? And so what's important about the whole idea of dignity and citizenship, and this is where initially they're at loggerheads against each other. For Malcolm, dignity is more important than citizenship initially, because all citizenship is, Marcellus, is the external recognition of our human God-given dignity. Malcolm says he doesn't need white folks to acknowledge his dignity. Black people have to acknowledge their own dignity. That's why Malcolm is always talking about self-determination. And way before we had folks like FUBU, for us, by us, Malcolm X was telling us FUBU, for us, by us, that Black people had to love themselves, build up their own wealth, their own communities, have community control, build up Black businesses, but also transform the criminal justice system. And we could do it all by ourselves with folks from Africa, with folks from the Caribbean, but it was going to be all Black, right? And so when we think about King's idea was citizenship, where King is like, pleading to the government, legislation, public policy, Supreme Court, the whole deal. Over time, they come to see that you need citizenship and dignity. And I would argue that Malcolm really influences Dr. King when we see Dr. King's radicalism, especially the last 3 years of Dr. King's life. So when we think about the sword and the shield, they are both sword and shield. At times, Malcolm is, for many years, Black America's prosecuting attorney. By 1963, 64, 65, he really becomes Black America's prime minister, and he's on the national global stage. He's meeting with Kwame Nkrumah in Africa. He's meeting with Nnamdi Azikiwe in Nigeria. He's meeting with Julius Nyerere in Tanzania. He's meeting with prime ministers, presidents, kings, monarchs, and he's pleading with them on behalf of us. So we think about Malcolm X. Why did he do what he was doing? Malcolm has personal sincerity, political integrity, but an unapologetic and unconditional love for Black people, all Black people, right? And so that's what he's doing. And that's going to influence Dr. King because really after Malcolm's assassination, Dr. King really becomes a political sword alongside of people like Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, Black Power activists. But Dr. King starts speaking truth to power against white supremacy. He starts saying that all white Americans have unconscious racism. He says to American Psychological Association, September 1st, 1967, that this country is falling apart because of white racism and white violence and white racial terror. And white people are lying about it and saying that there would be peace except for the chaos that white supremacy is causing. This is Dr. King. This is Dr. King, right? That's why the polling data shows us white folks hated Dr. King at the end. And I'll say it again. White folks hated Dr. King at the end, not because he was violent, but because he was telling the truth, the same truth that Malcolm X was saying in the early 1960s and the 1950s.
Yeah, there's a book, Martin's last book, Where Do We Go From Here? And if you read that, it breaks down so many almost what we would consider conspiracy theories that are even spoken to this day that he spoke of then. And yeah, that radical component was something that Martin and Malcolm definitely displayed. And as you broke down, because this is Rolling Out University, so we capture these gems, from our great Dr. Joseph, but as the sword and shield, which they both have played, but Malcolm represented as a prosecuting attorney that Black radical dignity, and
Absolutely.
Martin fought on the other side
Yeah.
for Black radical citizenship.
Yeah.
And I
And
almost
he's the
look at
defense attorney. Yeah, he's the defense attorney,
as the
right?
defense.
He's a
Yes.
defense attorney. So, and Malcolm is the prosecuting attorney. Malcolm's not trying to teach white people about Black humanity. King is the defense attorney. He's defending Blacks to white audiences, and he's defending whites to Black audiences. And here's what I mean. To white audiences, he tells them that Black people just want to assimilate and be part. They call it integration, but it's really assimilation and just be part of the mainstream society. To Black audiences, he's telling them that white folks are not intrinsically racist and awful, and are not these blonde, blue-eyed devils that Malcolm and the Nation of Islam are saying they are, right? Because Malcolm and the Nation are going to be really speaking what Toni Morrison calls unspeakable, unspoken truths about white supremacy, right? And here's one example, Brother Marcellus. So in 1957, there's a Little Rock Central High School crisis in Arkansas, where you got little Black girls trying to enter predominantly white school, and there are white mobs, including the Dallas Cowboy owner, Jerry Jones, is out there. And we got pictures of him. So there are white mobs heckling Black folks trying to get into school. And Eisenhower, President Eisenhower at the time, this is 1957, September, he sends in the military. The 101st Airborne come in there and they force those children to be able to go to school, the so-called Little Rock Nine. It's really important, and I write this in the book, to look at the reactions of Malcolm and Martin. Dr. King sends Eisenhower a telegram congratulating him, sending the military and sort of, in quotes, desegregating that school. Malcolm X is very, very upset. He's not congratulating. What Malcolm says, and here I agree with Malcolm, he says the United States is the sickest society on the face of the earth when small Black children, little Black girls, are trying to get into a high school, and you've got a mob of savages outside trying to prevent them from getting into that high school, right? Right? So when you think about Malcolm and Martin, dignity is understanding that you shouldn't go to any high school where there's 2,000 maniacs outside trying to prevent you from going to high school. You shouldn't try to get into any neighborhood when there are thousands of racial terrorists trying to prevent you from getting into the neighborhood, right? That's not separatism, that's dignity, right? And so when we think about dignity versus citizenship, Malcolm has a very specific conception that it's not a win to get into a university with armed military escorts and thousands of crazed white supremacists, including teenagers, their parents, people who thought of themselves as good Christians, but they weren't good Christians. They were murderous, racist, genocidal maniacs who wanted to prevent young black kids from going to public schools in the United States in 1957. Malcolm's willing to call out that truth in a very powerful way. It's going to take King years to understand the depth and breadth of racism. And by the time he does with the Vietnam speech, Riverside speech, April 4th, 1967, King says the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And he says that the United States is so racist that it's sending black and white troops over to Vietnam to murder the Vietnamese, but they couldn't live in the same neighborhood in Detroit. That's King in 1967. He's no longer sending telegrams to presidents congratulating them, right? Because he gets it. But the person who got it first is Malcolm X.
And you right there, Dr. Joseph, you broke down so many symptoms to the core, root problem, with regards to, and I'll even ask because you made a great point in the interview that you did, and you said being radical ultimately is being obsessed with the problem. And you mentioned that
Absolutely.
Martin and Malcolm were both. So for a child, let's say today, who has seen eyes on the prize, as his parents or grandparents have shown him and saw, you know, the 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 challenges of segregating schools and those nine in Little Rock, having such a hard time just going to school, or seeing in Birmingham, students and children being hosed down, in the streets just for protesting for these civil rights. When a child, and seeing today, as of recently, a teacher, murdered, by the hands of cops, an innocent black person, seeing George Floyd, hearing of a story of a 12-year-old and, being chased, by police, and ending in a fatality. To this day, if a child asks, and my mother's a teacher, well, she's been an educator in Chicago public school system. So she's had children ask her, after being taught this history, why do white people hate us?
Yeah.
And why does this nation try to keep us down? With the research that you've done on Martin and Malcolm, how would they answer that simply to a child?
Well, I think to a child, they would just say the original sin of the United States is racial slavery. And what racial slavery sets up is a caste system or a hierarchy that we got to think of as a ladder, with white people at the top and black people at the bottom. But not only are black people at the bottom, black people are exploited for their labor, their talent, their creativity, their genius. And all that is always redistributed upward back to the whites who are at the top of that ladder, at the top of that caste system. And we had a civil war from 1861 to 1865 where over 700,000 people died to end racial slavery. But after the end of racial slavery, even with the Reconstruction Amendments of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that end slavery, provide voting rights and citizenship for black people, white supremacists set up a new structure of racial segregation and convict lease systems and sharecropping and all kinds of violence that prevented black people from voting, that stole black people's lands and money, um, and continued to set up a system where whatever black people did, it was white people who were going to benefit from it, right? And that continues into 2023. So if we're going to tell the truth, we've got to tell the truth. Now, we also have to tell them about black genius and fortitude and the struggle for black citizenship and dignity that Malcolm and Martin really personify, alongside of all these different black women, the Angela Davises, Harriet Tubmans, Ida B. Wells. We have to tell them and teach them that, how despite all of that oppression, we have still, Maya Angelou says, and still we rise and still I rise, right? So we've still risen, but that's what we have to show them. And I think Malcolm and Martin understood the history. Malcolm was obsessed with history, began a study of American and global world history and religion and civilization in prison, from a prison cell, starting in 1946 until the day he died. And when we think about Dr. King's a very interesting figure because, unlike Malcolm, for a long time, Dr. King believes the okey doke. And what I mean by that is, Malcolm said for us not to be tricked and trained, and we've been bamboozled, and we've been led astray. But the okey doke is that Dr. King tried to put on the white cloak of Western civilization. That's why, King has been accused of plagiarizing the dissertation, all kinds of stuff. And we know from just Letter from Birmingham Jail that Dr. King was brilliant. All you have to do is read Letter from Birmingham Jail, which he wrote from the jail cell, and then they put together. So when no one was ghostwriting him or editing him, trying to get PhDs at predominantly white universities and trying to, in his first New York Times interview, he's talking about Hegel and listening to classical music with Coretta Scott King. The whole point that Dr. King didn't understand, especially the young King, is that folks who are African and Caribbean and Black, that is the intellectual tradition that you should be proud of and that you should try to live up to. There is not a single white author in the canon who's done more than Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, and who's done more than contemporary Black philosophers too, right? So
Facts.
Malcolm got that. Malcolm got that. The biggest salvation for us was going to be us, okay? And it wasn't going to be all. And it doesn't mean you can't read those folks. I've read those folks, but I'm saying the mountaintop, the Mount Rushmore of all of it is going to be a bunch of Black faces. That's what I'm saying. It's going to be a bunch of Black faces. The thing and the theory that's going to liberate you is coming from Black folks. It's not coming from other places.
Right. Wow. And when you talk about the convergences versus any conflicting ideals, what stand out to you as some of the deeper commonalities between their ideals?
And this is going to start, you're going to see start converging in 63, 64, 65, where by 64, you see Malcolm has the ballad or the bullet speech where he comes out in a full-throated way for citizenship and dignity, right? He's in an interview with Robert Penn Warren, and he says that Dr. King and I want the same thing, which is human dignity, right? So they're both human rights revolutionaries. They're both anti-colonial radicals. Malcolm visits Africa 3 times, first time for 5 weeks in 1959, then in 1964 between April and May of 1964, and then around July 13th and November 21st of 64. Dr. King visits Ghana in 1957, meets up with Nkrumah, and that becomes really an unprecedented visionary moment for him. To see an actual, the former Gold Coast, the British colonial Gold Coast, become an independent nation, Ghana. He's in Accra, and he's right there at the motherland and sees that is one of the ports where we were placed in the transatlantic slave trade. So that becomes a real epiphany for Dr. King. He visits India for a month and he meets the untouchables, the caste system in India. That becomes another epiphany. So they're both these anti-colonial activists. They are both radical critics and really revolutionary critics of white supremacy. Malcolm is the innovator here, willing to speak truth to power. King, especially the King of 1965, 66, 67, 68, becomes hugely vociferously against white supremacy publicly. It's important to let everyone know that King is no longer on speaking terms with the President of the United States. The President, Lyndon Johnson, does not go to King's funeral, okay? 125 million people watch King's funeral to show you the power of King, but so many people also hated King because King is a revolutionary and Malcolm was a revolutionary. So when you think about Malcolm, how is he a revolutionary? Well, Malcolm is a revolutionary who's talking about a global human rights movement that's going to include Africa, Black folks in America, in the Caribbean, all over the world, to try to transform systems of racist capitalism, systems of oppression worldwide, and inequality. That's what Malcolm is talking about. And for Malcolm, a lot of that is based on Black people recognizing their own human dignity and not seeking salvation in the minds and the thoughts and the traditions of other people. That's what Malcolm is talking about, right? And when we think about King, King is a revolutionary who's trying to use nonviolent civil disobedience to coerce a nation that's unapologetically racist into doing the right thing. So you see that with the Poor People's Campaign. He starts it in Marks, Mississippi, the poorest zip code in the country. Quitman County in 1968, and he's trying to bring Latinos and Asian Americans and poor whites together to have a march on Washington. Really, King starts the first Occupy Wall Street music movement. It's an Occupy Washington, D.C. movement. He wants them to nonviolently occupy D.C. until a guaranteed income is passed, right? And way before we talk about food deserts now and environmental justice, King was talking about all of that, right? So when we think about him as a revolutionary, we have to understand they try to convince us King was Santa Claus and he'd hug all the white folks he'd meet. What King was doing was compelling and forcing people to change, which is why so many different white folks hated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. with a real passion. Many white folks celebrated when King was assassinated, right? So King is a revolutionary who is trying to compel the country to do the right thing. He says militarism, racism, materialism are the triple evils facing humanity. And so King was against violence and war, but he was also against policy violence. You think about what's happening in Jackson, Mississippi right now, Black folks in brown water. King was against that, right? King wanted us all to have these flourishing lives. He was against economic inequality and economic justice. So both Malcolm and Martin are revolutionaries. They're anti-colonial radicals, and they're really human rights advocates on a global scale.
And the one of the revelations in this book, you know, The Sword and the Shield, that was amazing is when you speak of Martin Luther King going to Ghana and seeing the independence that was gained by Ghana by Kwame Nkrumah, and realizing that and seeing that and being able to use it as a benchmark and bring that back as an ideal North Star, you know, for the civil rights movement. And reading, you know, autobiography of Malcolm X when he began to travel, you know, to the nations in Africa and Egypt, and seeing the world and the struggles for independence, and being able to both of them being able to tie that back into the African American struggle. That seemed to be just an incredible breakthrough, and also empowered them with those types of connections. So, um, what would be what is the breakthrough when you talk about Black internationalism? Why is that so critical for our liberation as for Blacks here in America?
Oh, absolutely. You know, Brother Marcellus, it's, you know, Black internationalism is this idea that is connected to Pan-Africanism and the African diaspora, and is even bigger than that, because what Black internationalism does is conceive of Black folks and Blackness as a global human rights project, right? And it means that if our sisters and brothers are dying in Lagos, or if they're dying in Eritrea or Ethiopia or Tanzania or Ghana, like you were saying, that it matters to us. If they are in Jamaica and Haiti and any parts of the Caribbean, it matters to us, right? And so the Black internationalism that Malcolm personifies, and really King personifies as well, is really hugely important. 1955 is the Bandung Conference, and that takes place in Indonesia and is the start of what we call the Third World. In Bandung, representatives of 29 different countries representing over 1 billion people in population said that they weren't going to be the capitalist like the USA, and they weren't going to be the totalitarian socialism of the USSR, Soviet Union. They were going to do something different. And so Malcolm is extraordinarily inspired by Bandung and really spends the rest of his career trying to build a Black united front based on Bandung, Black International United Front, where you have Muslims, Christians, people who are atheists, as long as they were part of this revolutionary impulse. And it's extraordinary that King goes to Ghana in 1957, and then Malcolm, his first international trip is to the Middle East and Egypt in 1959, right? So they right around, and they're only 3.5 years apart. Dr. King is born January 15th, 1929. Malcolm X is May 19th, 1925. So it's very eerie the way in which they both do some of the same things, even though the press and white supremacy is trying to separate them, right? So it's really interesting. They both die at 39 or assassinated at 39. They're both family men, married. Between them, they had 10 children. You know, King has 4, Malcolm has 6. and two of them, his twins, are born posthumously after he's assassinated. So what's interesting is that for King in Ghana and then Malcolm in the Middle East, Malcolm is writing letters back to the mosque when he's in Jeddah and he's in Saudi Arabia and he's in Egypt, saying that you've got folks right here in the Middle East who would experience Jim Crow racial segregation if they came back home. So the Black internationalist piece is really important, where we understand what happens in Egypt matters to us. What happens in Ghana matters to us. What happens in Dominica matters to us. Grenada matters to us, because we are all part of this Pan-African revolutionary, third world Black internationalist project, right? And so it's interesting when you think about Malcolm. Kwame Ture said we are all African people, and he was correct, but it's really Malcolm he's following, because Malcolm's the person who goes to Africa. Malcolm's the person who says the only way we're going to be liberated here is if we can also liberate and unite Africa, right? In terms of this Pan-African impulse. So that Black internationalism piece is hugely important then and now. Black people are never going to have human dignity and citizenship unless we all have it together. So we always have to think about Africa. We always have to think about the Caribbean. We always have to think about Black people wherever they are, and that their struggles are inextricably linked and connected to our struggles.
Yeah, when we talk about the movement and that solution is, from Martin and Malcolm's perspective, anti-colonialism and the Black internationalism,
Mm-hmm.
and the breakthrough in Black dignity combined with, Black citizenship. This is a picture that I love, and you speak about this moment. I keep it here with me as inspiration. Um, Here in March 26, 1964, at the U.S. Senate,
Yeah.
as they were debating the Civil Rights Bill, they met for the first time. And you speak about this moment. So, seeing these great men, what was the significance of this moment from a political and unifying perspective?
Well, that's going to be the first and only time they meet up that close, even though later, December 16th, Malcolm is going to be sitting in the audience at Harlem and listening to a speech King gives after winning the Nobel Prize, and right after Malcolm has gone to both Africa and done his Oxford Union debate. It's very, very significant because in a lot of ways, those two meeting so many different forces, the FBI and different infiltrators and different state agencies, were both trying to assassinate both of them, but also prevent them from meeting so that they could get together and get on the same page. And in a lot of ways, that meeting is unplanned. There are plans for other meetings that don't take place. Malcolm is in contact with Clarence Jones, who's King's attorney and confidant, and Sidney Poitier's then wife, Juanita Poitier, who's a big time radical political activist, who lends, Malcolm can go to the house and all these different things. It's a huge significance because the media had set up Malcolm as this anti-white monster, that starting with Mike Wallace in 1959 with The Hate They Hate produced. Black people, Marcellus, never believed that. So Black people didn't believe that, but white people did. So they had the effect. They kind of had an unintended effect of making the Nation of Islam popular within the Black community after The Hate That Hate produced came out. But it also had the effect that they wanted to make white people very, very leery of the Nation of Islam and Malcolm. So the very fact that Malcolm and Martin meet, you see the picture of them smiling. There's another picture where they're not smiling, but that becomes broadcast all over the world, Associated Press and United Press International. It's hugely significant because I think it just shows us the power of movements for Black dignity and citizenship encompassed in those two figures. And they have such power and such resonance continuing in our day, because even as we have the MLK holiday that's sanctioned by the federal government, we know Black folks also celebrate Malcolm X Day on May 19th every year since his assassination. So there may never be a Malcolm X holiday, but we know that Black people look upon Malcolm as a patron saint too, just alongside of King. So I think that picture shows us the enormous possibilities and potentialities that they had in their lifetimes. But I think it gives us hope and some optimism for our lifetimes as well, because that struggle for citizenship and dignity continues, and we can continue to learn so much from their lives and activism and political thought.
Yeah, when you see the evolution of their movements and their impact, even after their deaths, even to this day, or even 2020, Black Lives Matter. Uh, what synergies do you see within the movement of Black Lives Matter to that created by Martin and Malcolm? And from your in-depth study, what level of admiration or critique would they have with regards to the current movement?
Well, I think BLM is absolutely influenced by both. I thought that what Black Lives Matter, especially, even starting in 2013, sort of the first iteration, and then blowing up in 2020, that's a movement for dignity and citizenship. It starts after the Trayvon Martin murder, and there's three Black women who started and popularized the hashtag, but there's a lot of Black men and other folks who are involved. I think that's been a really important movement. I think that in a lot of ways, it both builds and expands on uh, King's notion of citizenship and Malcolm's notion of dignity, because it's such an inclusive movement, right? Because at times, when we think about Black freedom struggles, we've had our own internal struggles, ideological fights, sexism, homophobia, queer phobia. We've had all kinds of issues. And I think what BLM has tried to do is put us all under one big tent. Which makes the most sense. If we're going to fight white supremacy, we don't need to be fighting each other. And so I think that I think they've done an extraordinary job. I think, if anything, what they have faced is just an onslaught of criticism. I think in 2020, because of getting so much money and resources so quickly, there's been allegations of financial malfeasance. That happened to Malcolm in the Nation of Islam. So, that happens. So if somebody gets some money who's not the ethical person who should have received the money gets misspent and the money can get abused, right? So that's not the first time we've heard that happen. Malcolm felt there was all kinds of corruptions in the Nation of Islam, which is why he's kicked out of the Nation of Islam, because Malcolm is a straight shooter. Malcolm took no money, no corruption, no alcohol, no extramarital affairs, nothing. So Malcolm is the real deal. But when you're the real deal, if the organization is not, then they're going to try to kill you, right? So I think when we think about BLM, they are facing some of the same growing pains that other organizations have faced in our history. They're facing some of the same subversiveness in terms of, you think about the COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program. There have been police raids and all kinds of threats and harassments against anti-racist activists, including and especially BLM. But I think what they've done in a really important way is push the whole nation to acknowledge the structural racism that we face. And we still have a big backlash, right? The critical race theory hoax by white supremacist elected officials and grassroots white supremacists as well, passing all kinds of legislation where we're preventing the teaching of Black history and a truthful version of American history. Because so much of what King and Malcolm was about was articulating and expressing so eloquently a truthful version of American history, right? And then we see voter suppression, right? The Shelby v. Holder decision by the Supreme Court in 2013. John Roberts, the head of the Supreme Court, I mean, he doesn't have a white sheet on, but the 5-4 decision ending the voting rights, that's a decision that the Klan would love, right? So we've got a 6-3 Supreme Court that's a white supremacist court. So, when we think about BLM and the legacies of Malcolm and Martin, I think they've amplified those legacies in big ways. And I think they've really done both. They've done aspects of the militancy of Malcolm, and they've also done the nonviolent civil disobedience, including shutting down highways, shutting down people's breakfasts and brunches, really protesting outside of police stations and politicians' offices. But also they've done things where they are behind the scenes trying to do policy changes for bail reform and policy changes for the criminal justice system and immigration policies and a number of different things. So I do think that they've been really important, and they've really stood on the shoulders of Malcolm and Martin among other giants.
Mm, agree. Totally. Uh, Last question that I'll ask, going back to Dr. Martin Luther King's last speech, and he mentioned, in 1968, we as a people will get to a promised land.
Yeah.
I mentioned I might not get there with you, but we as a people will get there. Um, 55 years later, when you see, the state of Black America today, based on, all that you've covered,
Mhm.
and what you see today, the sword and the shield and the evolution of their movements, including Malcolm, have we gotten to that promised land in Martin and Malcolm's perspective from what you could see? And if not, what would it take?
Well, we haven't gotten there yet. I mean, some of us have really flourished in the 55 years since Dr. King's assassination, and the 58 years since Malcolm X's assassination. And on some levels, a show like this, Rolling Out University, is an example of that flourishing. We've got so many young entrepreneurs, activists, folks in media, culture, politics, art, business, technology, doing extraordinary things that they wouldn't have had the opportunity to when Malcolm and Martin was alive. And that's good. The bad is that there's so many tens of millions of our people. There's about 45 million of us in this country, who are, incarcerated, living in poverty, having premature deaths and short lives, and living in systems of punishment, police abuse, policy violence against them, including folks in Flint, Michigan, Jackson, Mississippi, who don't have clean water. They don't have clean air to breathe. They live in housing projects and tenements. Their kids, our kids, have more diabetes and asthma and all kinds of issues than white kids, right? And so that means that we haven't reached the mountaintop in the promised land, because what King and Malcolm wanted was for all of us to flourish. There's a great quote from Malcolm X after he comes back from Africa in '64, before his second trip, where he says that, there are white people coming up to him and saying how great he is. And, he's saying, hey, not all white people are 100% racist, especially if they embrace Islam and they become anti-racist. But he says that as long as there's one Black person who's being mistreated, he doesn't care about any kind of appreciation or attempts at dignity that white people are going to give him as an individual, because he's thinking of the collective. And that's how we have to all think. We can't worry about the Black first and say, okay, we have a first Black vice president. We have a first Black president in Obama, and then Kamala Harris. We have to say, how is the entire community collectively doing, especially what King called the least of these, right? So it means people who are in prison. And remember, Malcolm X spent almost 7 years in prison from 1946 to 1952. So those who are incarcerated, those who are formerly incarcerated, those who are disabled. We have to think about Black women and girls. We have to think about Black men and boys, Black folks who are queer and trans. So there's a whole community of folks who are still being systematically oppressed and marginalized, murdered and punished out there. So until we fix that, we will not have made it. And I think the extraordinary example of Malcolm and Martin is that they wanted to save all of us. Sometimes people say, oh, you can't save everybody. I actually don't think that's true. I think you can, and you should be striving to save everybody. And that's what's so great about Malcolm and Martin. They did believe we could save everyone. And that's what we have to continue to pursue. And I think the way we get there, Marcellus, is by telling the truth about this history and this story. It's telling the truth. One of the things we're seeing in our own time in 2023 is that so many forces of backlash are about ending Black people's ability to speak their own truths, right? And it's a narrative war that happens. And sometimes it's a physical war, but it's a narrative war between those who are believers of Reconstruction, Reconstructionist supporters of multiracial democracy, and redemptionist supporters of the lost cause and white supremacy. And Malcolm and Martin obviously are radical Reconstructionists, And that's the side that we should be on, not just Reconstruction, but as radical Reconstructionists who believe that everyone can be saved, especially all the Black people who are being oppressed. Because if we save those Black people, that's going to reverberate to every single group that's out there racially and ethnically in every single corner of the globe. We're not going to just save Black people and get a new group of people to oppress. It just won't happen.
Love that. I think that's the man, one of the great words to end it on, that radical reconstruction. You're actually, Dr. Joseph, a champion of the third Reconstruction movement. And so tell us how we can continue to follow you. I encourage every person in Rolling Out University, every Black American, every Black person around the globe, every person living on this planet to get this book, The Sword and the Shield. It is a transformative read. Please tell us how we can follow you. And also, you can get this book at blackbookstore.com, the Rolling Out bookstore platform. But how can we follow you? Some of the other books that we can read from you, and how we can just stay in tune with your movement.
Oh, no, great. Thank you so much, Brother Marcellus. I'm on Twitter at Peniel Joseph. I'm also on Instagram as at Dr. Peniel Joseph. And I'm on Facebook as Peniel Joseph and LinkedIn and the whole deal. Yeah, the latest book is The Third Reconstruction. We're on a book tour now, America's Struggle for Racial Justice in the 21st Century, which really looks at 3 different periods of Reconstruction and how Black people have survived those periods, but how we can thrive during this latest period of Reconstruction. So I would hope that Rolling Out University has that one too available. And that Audible I actually read. That's the first Audible that I've read, The Third Reconstruction. So thank you so much for this. It's been really great, and hope to be able to talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joseph. And I can't wait to hear that update when you've sold 8 billion copies of your collective books, meaning everybody on the planet has the most necessary reading, for elevating and empowering
Yeah,
our culture.
and I forgot to say, so Disney Plus, that's going to Sword in the Shield is going to be an 8-episode series called
Oh,
MLKX on Disney Plus. And
wow.
it's a live action series. They've already started shooting, and I'm in the writer's room there too. So that's going to be out soon.
Dr. Joseph, can't thank you enough for all that you're doing for our culture. You've become one of my favorite authors of all time,
Thank
and
you. I
I
appreciate it.
look forward to devouring all your books throughout this year and many more. So thank you once again. Thank you for viewing Rolling Out University, Leadership and Equity, The Sword and the Shield, Dream by Any Means. Happy MLK Day.